Hello, this is the Unit 5 Differential Impacts, Vulnerability, and Preparedness by Population, Location, and Demographic Factors, Week 12, Poor and Minority Status Within Country Disparities, mini lecture for Sci 333, Psychology of Disasters and Climate Change at the University of Maine at Augusta. This week we are continuing our exploration of disparities and the impacts and vulnerability of climate change. I have reduced your reading assignment for this week. We will only have the Pender-Hughes chapter. It's important to note that while we are exploring the disparity, that it doesn't arise from nothing. It's not like 5 years ago suddenly started to have socioeconomic and racial disparities. These disparities are deeply ingrained in our societies. They've existed for generations, for centuries even. The very rules, legal and social, upon which our society is founded are steeped in discrimination against poor and minority people. Because these rules were developed with discrimination as status quo, and because these institutions were built by the rules, and because our current society is structured around these institutions, we could remove every racist or bigoted person. We could remove every racist or bigoted intent from our current society, but still be left with racist and bigoted outcomes, specifically for our conversation today, the disparity of impacts and vulnerability. The Pender-Hughes chapter, The Impact of Race on Environmental Quality, explores the reality of these disparities. As a warning, many students I've had, and I'll include myself in this group to be honest, find this chapter to be deeply disturbing. Like I said, the disparity of existence around race and social class are so deeply tied to the structure of our society that, number one, even with all of the great strides that we've taken in the past 50 or so years, they still exist. Remember, removing the intent of discrimination is not on its own sufficient to removing the reality of discrimination. And number two, for people who are not the victims of this discrimination, it's largely invisible. That is to say, white people and people who do not live in poverty are less likely to personally experience the impacts of this disparity, and so it's less likely to be part of their lived reality in their daily lives. Since most people don't spend their day-to-day lives thinking, oh, I want to create environmental devastation in communities of poor and brown people. Most people are largely unaware that such environmental devastation exists. There is not the intent, and so the disparity continues to occur unintentionally, and in many cases, invisibly. Reading about the realities of the disparity that exists in our country is disturbing. People may want to deny that it could possibly be real because, again, it's outside of their own lived experience. And people may want to look for someone to blame, but again, the structures that cause this are old and are institutionalized, meaning that they are deeply interwoven into the fabric of society. It's not like there's this one guy out there somewhere, and if we could change his mind, we could fix everything. These issues are deep and pervasive. Pender-Hughes begins the chapter by providing an overview of this reality, making it visible. Case after case after case of environmental disparity, of toxic waste sites placed in poor and minority communities, pollutions heaped upon indigenous populations, physical and health impacts disproportionately experienced by poor people and by ethnic and racial minorities in our country. Pender-Hughes explores study after study, report after report, finding that those in our country who have less power and less access to resources will experience more discrimination in the form of living in dangerous, polluted, and chemically toxic environments. And again, those who have more power and more access to resources get to exert that power and say, not in my backyard. Their issues are addressed and the environmental devastation disappears from their sight, from their reality, pushed into locations that are homes to people without the same power, and thus it becomes invisible. Pender-Hughes discusses the theoretical and historical backgrounds that create this disparate reality. discusses the extent to which the discrimination is institutionalized and therefore continues to operate as part of the status quo, with or without intention by any particular member or leader of society. But finally, Pender-Hughes closes the chapter by reviewing the environmental justice movement. As I said, we can remove the intent of discrimination from our system, but the system will continue to operate with discrimination. However, we can intentionally change the system to operate differently. And that is the point of the environmental justice movement. First, to recognize that we do not live the same reality. We live different realities based on who we are within a society. We need to recognize this disparity, this discrimination, recognize the polluted environments and health impacts and the devastation that exists in the lives of the poor minority people in our society. So first, the environmental justice movement makes the invisible visible. Second, we must take action to change it. Action by action, policy by policy, piece by piece. Pender-Hughes reports the actions that are being intentionally taken to remove discrimination from the system and to make it far safer and healthier and sustainable for all communities and all environments. After seeing, and sometimes for the first time, the disparity that exists in our country, it's freeing to realize that others see it too and are doing something about it, and we can as well. And so let's bring it back to climate change. The disparity that exists between populations in the United States and around the world is not new. It is deeply ingrained into the structures and power and economy within the world. And to many, including many of those who are in power and who make decisions regarding climate change actions, this disparity is invisible. We as professionals who work in disaster and climate change issues must see it, we must bring it to light, and we must prepare for it within mind. Actions for mitigation to reduce the climate changes must be made by those who have the power to act, even when developing nations are unable to match those actions because they can't afford to. Actions for adaptation to prepare societies so that as the changes occur, we can continue to function and thrive as a society. These actions for adaptation must be made with the understanding that some people are more vulnerable than other people. We do not prepare only the wealthiest members of our society to keep them safe from disaster, to keep them safe from blizzards. We have to prepare the entire society, and therefore we have to see the different lived realities. And finally, we've mentioned development a few times in this class. Developing nations are in a continual process of growth to meet the needs of their people. When infrastructure and education and food and water systems, healthcare, and every other social structure is being developed, it must be funded to support climate changes that will occur and to protect people within the society at all levels of vulnerability, at all levels of power. Actions must be taken with intention. We cannot be blinded to the realities of those who are most vulnerable within the society, and so that's that first step within the environmental justice movement, including within the climate change research and action movements. For your class activities this week, your interview paper will be due next week. I've talked with several of you about your projects and your papers, about your interviews and how they've gone. As always, contact me if you want to talk through any of these issues, if you want to brainstorm about your project or any of the ongoing activities that you are working on. Keep an eye on your email and on the course announcements for updates, and I will talk with you soon.